Every family has secrets. Most of them stay hidden, locked away in old boxes, unspoken at dinner tables, carried quietly to graves. But sometimes, just sometimes, one single night tears everything open. The Hargrove family thought they were coming together for a reunion. Food, music, old memories, catching up on lost time. By the time that night was over, one of them was dead. A will that changed everything turned out to be fake, and a person nobody knew existed walked out of the shadows and blew the entire family apart. Before we get into it, if you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. The Hargrove family was old money. Not the loud kind of rich, the quiet kind. The kind where the house has been in the family for 3 generations and nobody talks about exactly how much anything is worth, but everyone knows it is a lot. The man who built all of it was Edward Hargrove Sr. He died 2 years before this story begins, 81 years old, sharp until the very end. Left behind a will, a fortune, and 3 adult children who had not all been in the same room since his funeral. Those 3 children were Douglas, the oldest, 57. He had run the family's real estate business for 20 years and believed with every bone in his body that the estate and everything attached to it was his by right. He was the kind of man who smiled at you while deciding how to use you. His wife, Carol, stood beside him at every function, looking perfectly composed and feeling absolutely nothing. Renee, the middle child, 53. She had married well, divorced badly, and spent the years in between becoming the sharpest person in any room she walked into. She had a way of watching people, really watching them, that made them nervous without knowing why. She had driven up from Atlanta the morning of the reunion and had not told anyone why she seemed so tense when she arrived. Thomas, the youngest, 48. He was the one the family talked about in lowered voices. He had never really settled, different cities, different careers, different women. He showed up to the reunion 3 hours late in a car nobody recognized, wearing a jacket that cost more than his last known salary, and he smiled at everyone like a man who was holding a very good hand of cards. Then there were the others. Douglas's son, Brandon, 31, quiet, always watching. His girlfriend, Priya, who nobody in the family had met before that weekend, and who noticed things that polite guests are not supposed to notice. Renee's daughter, Simone, 28, a law student, home for the weekend. She was the one who would eventually find the will. And the staff, the cook, the groundskeeper, and a new personal assistant named Delia, young professional, hired by Douglas 6 months before the reunion. Nobody thought much about Delia at first. The reunion started on a Friday evening. The plan was a full weekend, because everyone in that house knew the real reason they were all there. Edward Sr.'s will had never been fully settled. There had been a dispute, quiet, legal, expensive, that had been going on for 2 years. The will stated that the estate and the bulk of the fortune went to Douglas. Renee had contested it. Thomas had stayed out of it publicly, while privately encouraging Renee with text messages he thought nobody else would ever read. The lawyers had suggested the family come together and try to resolve things without another year of court fees. So here they all were, together, at the house, pretending. Dinner that first night was beautiful and awful. The food was perfect, the table was set like something out of a magazine, the candles were lit, the wine was expensive, and underneath all of it, underneath every polite question and careful answer and practiced smile, the tension was so thick you could press your finger into it. Douglas sat at the head of the table, his father's chair. Renee noticed and said nothing, but her jaw tightened by a degree. Thomas arrived late and took the seat at the opposite end, his father's other traditional spot, and Douglas watched him do it with a smile that never touched his eyes. After dinner, Douglas made a toast to family, to legacy, to their father's memory. Everyone raised their glasses, everyone drank, some of them meant it. By 11 p.m., the house was settling, doors closing, lights going off one by one. By midnight, only 2 lights were still on. One was in Thomas's room, the other was in Delia's. Thomas Hargrove and Delia had been seeing each other for 4 months. Not publicly, not officially. The kind of arrangement that exists in stolen hours and careful lies and the particular electricity of something that cannot be spoken out loud. She had been Douglas's personal assistant for 6 months. She had access to his files, his calendar, his correspondence. She had seen things she was not meant to see. And when Thomas had first flirted with her over dinner in the city, her decision to flirt back had not been entirely separate from what she already knew about the Hargrove family and their money. Delia was not a bad person, but she was a smart one. And she was tired of being the person in the room that everyone looked through. What she knew, what she had seen in Douglas's private files 3 months before the reunion was this: the will was not the original. The document that had been submitted to the court, the one that left everything to Douglas, was different from the version she had seen in a locked drawer in Douglas's home office. Different enough to matter, different in the way that shifts an entire fortune from one person to several. She had photographed it. Both versions, she had not yet decided what to do with those photographs until the reunion gave her the answer. Saturday morning was almost peaceful. People moved around the estate at their own pace. Renee walked the grounds alone early, the way she had as a girl. Thomas slept late. Brandon and Priya sat on the back porch with coffee and spoke quietly. Carol took a long bath and came down to breakfast looking composed and slightly distant. Douglas made phone calls from his father's old study with the door closed. At lunch, something shifted. Thomas made a comment, casual, almost throwaway, about how interesting it was that the estate lawyer had been replaced right around the time the new will was filed. He said it like he was just making conversation, like it was just an observation. Douglas went very still. Renee looked up from her plate. Thomas smiled and asked someone to pass the bread. That afternoon, Simone found the envelope. She had been looking for a phone charger in the small sitting room off the main hall, a room that had been her grandfather's favorite, full of old books and older furniture. Behind a framed photograph of Edward Sr. that she had lifted to look at a loose edge of paper, she almost put it back. She pulled it instead. Inside the envelope were 2 documents. Both were versions of Edward Hargrove Sr.'s will. They were not the same. In the original, the older one, handwritten annotations in the margins in her grandfather's handwriting. The estate was divided. Douglas received the business. Renee received the house and the land. Thomas received a sum of money, and there was a 4th name, a name Simone did not recognize, a name with a percentage attached to it that was larger than anything left to the 3 siblings. She sat on the floor of that sitting room for a long time. Then she took photographs of both documents on her phone. Then she went to find her mother. Hold on, because this is the part where everything is about to collapse. If you are watching this on your phone right now, put it down somewhere flat. You are going to want both hands free for the rest of this story. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because this is exactly the kind of story we bring you every single week. All right, back to the Hargroves. The name in the original will was James Callum Hargrove. Renee had never heard it. Simone had never heard it. They sat together in Renee's room with the door locked and the photographs pulled up on Simone's phone, and they went through both documents line by line. The forged will, the one filed in court, had 4 differences from the original. The split of assets was one. The removal of James Callum Hargrove was another. The 3rd was a change in the date. The 4th was Douglas's signature appearing in a place where the original had only their father's. Renee was a smart woman. She had always been a smart woman. She understood immediately what she was looking at. She called her lawyer from the bathroom with the shower running. Meanwhile, downstairs, Douglas was having his own conversation with Delia. He had found her phone in the kitchen. She had left it on the counter while cooking, and it had lit up with a message from Thomas. The message itself was vague enough, but the name on the screen and the frequency of the messages when he scrolled just enough to see told him everything he needed to know about Thomas and his assistant. He set the phone back exactly where he found it. He poured himself a drink. He stood at the kitchen window looking out at the pond his father had loved, and he thought about all the things he had done to protect what he believed was his. All the choices, all the arrangements. The lawyer who had been so helpful, the document that had been so carefully adjusted, the years of work. He thought about James Callum Hargrove, and he understood that the weekend was no longer going to end the way he had planned. Dinner that night was different from the first. The food was the same, the table was the same, but the people sitting around it were different versions of themselves than they had been 24 hours ago. Everyone was carrying something they had not been carrying at Friday's dinner, and the weight of all those carried things pressed down on the table like weather. Thomas was quieter than usual. Renee was watchful in a new way, not her usual sharp observation, but something more focused, like a person who has identified a target. Douglas talked more than anyone, filled the silences, told a long story about a development deal that nobody was listening to, laughed at his own jokes. Carol drank. Priya watched Delia refill the water glasses and caught the moment, just one moment, 2 seconds, where Delia's hand and Thomas's shoulder were in the same frame, and the air between them was different from the air in the rest of the room. She nudged Brandon under the table. He looked up too late. After dinner, the family moved to the large sitting room. Someone put music on. Someone opened another bottle. And then Renee, standing in the center of the room with a glass of wine she had barely touched, said very calmly, "Douglas, who is James Callum Hargrove?" The room stopped. Douglas's face did something complicated in the space of 1 second. Then it went smooth and controlled. "Where did you hear that name?" "Dad's will," Renee said. "The real one." Thomas went very still. Carol set her glass down. Douglas stood up slowly. "I don't know what you think you found." "I have photographs," Simone said from the corner of the room. She held up her phone. What happened next happened fast. Douglas crossed the room towards Simone. Brandon stepped in front of him, not violently, just physically present, blocking. Douglas stopped. His face was doing something none of them had seen before. All the smoothness gone, something underneath it that was older and more frightened. "You need to put that away," Douglas said. His voice was quiet. That was almost worse than if he had shouted. "Who is he, Douglas?" Renee said again. Douglas looked at his sister for a long time. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he walked out of the room. They heard his footsteps on the stairs. They heard his bedroom door close. The room breathed. "Someone needs to tell me what is going on," Brandon said. Nobody answered him right away. Then Delia, still standing near the doorway where she had been clearing glasses, Delia, who had been so quiet for 2 days, so professional, so invisible, said, "I know who James Hargrove is." Everyone looked at her. And I think Douglas knows I know, which means she looked at Thomas. "I don't think I should be in this house tonight." They found Douglas at the bottom of the estate's main staircase at 2:17 in the morning. Priya found him. She had come downstairs for water. She turned on the hallway light, and there he was. She did not scream. She stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then she went back upstairs and woke Brandon. Brandon called 911. By the time the police arrived, the whole house was awake. Everyone gathered in the main sitting room in various states of shock and sleepwear, nobody speaking much, nobody looking directly at anyone else. The initial assessment was a fall. The stairs were old. The lighting on the upper landing was poor. A man in his late 50s coming downstairs in the middle of the night. But Renee looked at the staircase from the doorway of the sitting room, and she thought about Douglas's face when he had walked out of that room 3 hours ago. And she thought about the smoothness that had left it. And she thought about a man who had forged his own father's will standing at the top of those stairs, knowing that everything he had built was about to come apart. And she was not sure she believed it was an accident. The detective who arrived, a quiet woman named Torres, walked through the house with the particular unhurried attention of someone who was already asking questions she hadn't yet asked out loud. She spoke to everyone. She was especially interested in the conversation that had happened in the sitting room before Douglas left. She was especially interested in Delia. And she was very interested, very quietly, very carefully interested in a muddy footprint on the upper landing that did not match Douglas's shoes. Delia told Detective Torres everything. The 2 versions of the will, the photographs on her phone, the locked drawer in Douglas's home office, the lawyer whose name appeared in both documents in ways that did not make sense. She told her about Thomas. Not to protect herself, she was past that. She told her because Torres asked directly, and Delia had decided that the only way out of this house and this situation was a straight line, and the straight line was the truth. Torres listened without expression. Then she asked one question. The 4th name in the original will, James Callum Hargrove. Do you know who he is? Delia looked at her hands for a moment. "I think he's Edward Sr.'s son," she said, "from before the family, before Patricia, before any of them." Torres wrote something down. "How do you know that?" "I found letters," Delia said, "in the same drawer as the will, old letters. A woman named Marie from the early 1970s, the last one mentioned a baby." Torres looked up from her notepad. "Where are these letters now?" "Still in the drawer," Delia said, "in Douglas's office. in the city. Torres closed her notepad. She stood up. "Miss Delia," she said, "I'm going to need you to not go anywhere for a while." It took the investigators 11 days to find James Callum Hargrove. He was 61 years old. He lived in Portland, Oregon. He worked as a high school history teacher. He had a daughter, a mortgage, and absolutely no idea that his biological father had been one of the wealthiest men in Savannah, Georgia. His mother, Marie, had died in 2019. She had left him a box of letters he had never opened because the grief of losing her had been too fresh, and then enough time had passed that opening them felt like disturbing, something settled. The detective's call was the first time anyone had ever said the name Edward Hargrove to him in connection with himself. He sat in his kitchen in Portland for a very long time after that call. Then he opened his mother's box. The letters confirmed everything. His mother and Edward Sr. had been together for 2 years in the early 70s, before Edward married Patricia, before the family, before the estate, before any of it. When Marie had become pregnant, Edward had given her money and ended the relationship. She had raised James alone and never asked Edward for anything again. But Edward had never forgotten, because the original will, the real one, had included his firstborn son. Douglas had known. That was clear from the investigation. He had found out years ago how exactly was still being untangled, and he had worked quietly, carefully, and expensively to make sure that knowledge stayed buried, along with any claim James might have to the estate. The forged will was the last piece of that work. The muddy footprint on the landing was matched to a shoe size that did not belong to Douglas. The investigation into Douglas's death was reclassified. It was no longer being treated as an accident. The trial took 14 months. The details that came out during those 14 months were the kind that keep courtroom reporters busy and family attorneys billing for years. The forged will was thrown out entirely. The estate went into a full legal review. Renee's original contest was upheld. Thomas's private encouragement of Renee via the text messages became briefly relevant and then irrelevant. James Callum Hargrove flew to Savannah for the first time in his life and stood outside the estate on a Tuesday morning in October and looked at the house his father had built and felt something he could not name. He did not fight for the money. He had a lawyer, a good one, paid for by Renee, who felt that the least the family could do was make sure Edward Sr.'s actual wishes were honored. But James himself was not interested in the fortune or the legal battle. He wanted one thing. He wanted to know his sisters. Renee met him for coffee in the city 3 weeks after the first trial hearing. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and she looked at his face, his jaw, his eyes, the way he held his coffee cup, and she saw her father in him so clearly that she had to look away for a moment. They talked for 4 hours. Thomas met him once and then did not stay in touch. That was Thomas. Carol moved out of the family home 2 months into the trial and filed for divorce shortly after. She had spent 30 years beside Douglas and had known less about him than the woman who had worked for him for 6 months. That was something she would be working through for a long time. Delia cooperated fully with the investigation. She was not charged with anything. She left Savannah and did not look back. Brandon and Priya got engaged the following spring. At the engagement party, Priya told Simone that she had known something was wrong from the very first dinner. Simone asked her how. Priya said she had learned a long time ago to watch the people who were trying hardest to seem like they weren't watching anyone. As for Detective Torres, she closed the case 18 months after that Saturday night on the Hargrove estate. The verdict was not accidental death. Who exactly was at the top of those stairs with Douglas Hargrove and what exactly happened in those final moments was established in court and recorded in the public record. But that is a story for another day. The Hargrove family came together for a reunion. They left with a dead brother, a forged will, a hidden heir, and more truth than any of them had been prepared to carry. Secrets do not stay buried. That is the one thing this family learned too late and too hard. If you made it to the end of this story, drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. And share this with someone who loves a good mystery, because that person is going to want to watch this from the very beginning. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week there is a new story waiting here for you. I will see you in the next one.